Hi, welcome to another session here on the Expanded States of Consciousness World Summit. I'm thrilled to be here today with Gangaji. My name is Fleet Mall. I'm your co-host, and I've really been looking forward to this conversation with you. Welcome, Gangaji.
Thank you. Really happy to be here.
Yeah. So I'm going to share a bit of your bio, and then we'll jump right into the conversation. Sound good?
Sounds good.
Okay. So Gangaji, born Tony Robinson, grew up in Clarksdale, Mississippi. Like many of her contemporaries, she searched for fulfillment through relationships, career, motherhood, subculture experiences, political activism, and spiritual practice. While she had never planned to go to India, it was on the banks of the Ganga River that her search ended in 1990. Gangaji met her teacher, H.W.L. Punjaji. Today, as a teacher and author, Gangaji speaks to people from all walks of life, inviting them to fully recognize the absolute freedom and unchanging peace that is the truth of one's being. Gangaji lives with her husband, Eli Jackson Bear, in Oregon. She is the author of The Diamond in Your Pocket, Discovering Your True Radiance, Freedom and Resolve, The Living Edge of Surrender, Hidden Treasure, Uncovering the Truth of Your Life Story, and You Are That, Volume 1 and 2. For more information about Gangaji, you can go to her website, gangaji.org. Okay. So the theme of this summit does have to do with expanded states of consciousness, expanded states of awareness, and sometimes called non-ordinary states, have been called by various names, accessed through a variety of means, including meditation, self-inquiry, psychedelics, shamanism, ecstatic dance, breath work, and so on, and their potential for healing, for self-actualization, for awakening. So I'm just curious about this term, expanded states of consciousness, whether that kind of resonates for you, and if so, how would you kind of maybe define it, or what would your understanding of it be to just kind of set the stage for our conversation today?
Well, it was a term that I haven't used or thought about much, but when I saw your questions and I looked at it, I realized that certainly there were certain expanded moments of my consciousness that led me to my teacher. Just even being in the San Francisco Bay Area in the early 1970s was an expanded state of consciousness for me from Mississippi. And it did blow my mind open in lots of ways, just the subculture and the substances and then the spiritual practices that I got introduced to. So my goal became to acquire a permanent, expanded consciousness, a permanent state. And that's, I understand it now as a yogic goal, but I did all kinds of things. I tried lots of things, and I had lots of beautiful experiences, and I met wonderful teachers, and I'm forever grateful. But I always return to the suffering of my personality or my persona. And so by the late 1980s, both my husband and I really recognized we needed a teacher, even though I had gone briefly through a guru phase. I was not into gurus or into teachers. I thought they mainly did more harm than they did good. And so I was, you could say, anti-guru. But I didn't necessarily want a guru. I wanted a teacher. I imagined maybe a goddess or something, something more handleable. But really, within 6 months of that prayer, that plea out into the universe, I had met my teacher, who turned out to be an Indian guru, and I was at his feet, and he showed me, and he threw me into, I would have to say, a stateless state. I couldn't even say it's an expanded state, because his whole teaching was, you are what is always here, in both expansion and contraction. And most of us have had contraction, had the experiences of contraction. And so perhaps we need expanded states, and then we want expanded states so that we can finally discover that we are the presence that's here regardless of state. So that I had never heard before. Everything I had been doing or learning was really about getting somewhere where I would never have to deal with my unnecessary suffering, my personality, my fixation. And he told me to stop right where you are and recognize what is always here. Because if it is something that comes and goes, it's subject to change in any way, it's not reality. Reality, by his definition, was what doesn't change. And truly, I had never considered that. I had been so intent on changing what I thought I was that I had never considered paying attention to what is and has always been here. So it was revolutionary for me and radical. And I can't say that I offer or teach or invite people even to expanded states, but I do recognize that through an expanded state, you are touched in a way that usually makes you want more of the truth of yourself, more of the boundarylessness of yourself. And that's the beginning of inquiry, which is really what my teacher and Ramana offer, is really self-inquiry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we certainly want to explore that more. I'm glad you brought up that, you had a lot of experiences just in the subculture of the time. I'm sure, like many of us of our baby boomer generation, the substances and all the rest of it, as well as spiritual practices and a lot of beautiful experiences, expanded state experiences. But most of us found ourselves circling back and still having to deal with the suffering of our persona and our personality, right? And I think that's an arc in our summit here of how do you move from expanded state experiences to integration and to something that's more timeless and so forth. And so you've described that experience that you had with your teacher, Punjaji, on the banks of the Ganga River as really having changed everything for you. Was it primarily just his presence, or did he do self-inquiry with you kind of on the spot? Or was it just his presence that kind of stopped your mind? Because, having our mind stopped, again, could be another expanded state experience, but something really shifted in a deep way for you, obviously.
Well, it was both. Both his presence. It's true, I had never heard what he was saying. He told me when I met him, he said, "What do you want?" And some reason I said, "Freedom." I could have said any number of things, enlightenment, whatever. That's just what came out. And he said, "Good. Now just sit down there and be still." So being a meditator, I thought I knew what sit down there and be still meant. And so I went into meditation, and I don't know if I counted my breaths or just stilled my mind. And he said, no, that's too much. Don't do anything. Stop whatever you are doing. And when I really heard him say that, I was terrified because I assumed I would lose all the ground that I had gained. And I knew I was in a much better place than I was when before I escaped to California. So it was a fear, but I knew I was with the right person. I'm sure you've had this experience since you were with Trungpa, that you just have to trust your experience. That's what I finally came to, that I have to trust this. And so I did. And I was willing to be still, and he said, "Don't reach for anything. Stop searching." And my whole life had been defined by searching at that point for a couple of decades. So it was a huge thing that I heard him say. It wasn't just meditate now. It was give up the search. And my assumption about losing everything, when I voiced that to him, he said, "That's it, exactly, lose everything." So Poetically, that could be interesting or as a spiritual construct, but he was really inviting me to the experience of losing everything and then telling the truth about what is still here.
Mm-hmm.
So he said at another time, lose both your enlightenment and your unenlightenment.
Mm-hmm.
And that was earth-shaking for me. I was at peace, but not a peace that I had to cling to, because it didn't exclude any other state. So I could also experience, I got very sick while I was there. I could experience the psychological fear of being sick and still recognize that deeper than that, or included in that, or that is included in this oceanic, endless peace, a peace of being.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and what you describes there kind of leads into my next question. So, generally, in terms of your path as a teacher, you're associated with non-dual approaches to realization and awakening, and with the Advaita teachings. So I'm wondering if, to begin with, you could, and that's a particular focus in terms of how we're looking at meditation for the summer. We're looking at it both in terms of awakening and also as a practice for integration. But in terms of awakening, we're focusing particularly on kind of non-dual approaches for the most part. And so I wonder if you could describe for us what those terms mean for you, or what they traditionally mean, Advaita and non-dual. I know that the direct literal translation of Advaita is not two.
Well, I'd never heard the term Advaita when I met Papaji. And when I brought that up with him later, he said, that's good. Then you don't have any pre-knowledge of what it is. You discover directly. And even Ramana, as I understand it, was in his awakening, or just before his awakening, he was a young boy who was interested more in sports than religion. And so Advaita was also then later put on top of him, or used to define him. But I don't say I'm an Advaitist, because I don't even know really what that would mean. And I have said, no other, and you are that. But you had asked me a question beforehand about the you are that, and the Advaita part of the Sanskrit phrase that you are that is a translation of, but I didn't know that phrase. I really did that book title because of Nisargada's book, which was I Am That. And having grown up a Christian, and at some point recognizing that it was said that Jesus said, I and my Father are one. And then all the Christians said, he and his Father are one. And so when Nisargadatta wrote his book, I Am That, people said about him, oh, he is that. So the book title, You Are That, was really just a play on all those thought forms, religious inductions that had come before. So I basically teach people in a really simple way through conversation, not through any formal meditative practice, although I encourage whatever practice, but finally the willingness to give up everything, including your practice, to really be still.
Yeah, it's difficult doing an interview with someone like you, because we could just stop talking and drop into stillness. And maybe the audience would sit with us for the next half hour.
People come to meetings. I have meetings all over, small group meetings and bigger meetings, and I talk a lot. I'm a sort of talkative person, and I'm interested in a lot of things, movies and novels and the newspaper and the news and good news, bad news. And people often ask me, well, I expected you to be a quiet type person. But that's not my type. My type is going on on top of this ocean of stillness. I do meditate each day, but really I do that because it's so good for my body and for my mind stream, because I tend to have an active mind stream. So the stillness that I'm really inviting people to is what is always here. It's not someplace to get. It's what can be realized as here.
So you mentioned that even after the experience you had with your teacher, Punjaji, and even during that first period there in India, you got sick and physically sick and experienced the psychological fear around being sick, but that, and you still didn't completely depart from that stillness that he had introduced you to, that stateless state or what have you. And so I'm curious because in my experience, the more experiences we have of whatever you want to call that stateless state, non-self, boundlessness, even beyond where even the witness is dissolving. And the more of these you have, they begin to thread together. And it's kind of always there in the background. It may not be that you're able to live your life completely from that. It's not that you don't still have various upheavals and things going on, but it's kind of always there in the background, which does make a huge difference. And I'm curious if there's a distinction between that and some notion that those kind of sufferings are just not going to rise altogether anymore. Maybe that's a fantasy we all have. As long as we're in a body, there's going to be something, right? But I'm curious about how that resonates with you. The idea that it kind of these experiences link together, and then there's kind of this background awareness of that changeless state.
Yes, and I do think, well, I certainly, in my own experience, there was a moment after I'd left Papaji that first visit where I was going through like an emotional anguish, and coupled with the thinking, I shouldn't have left. I should be sweeping his floor. I should be there. I was in a state of grace. And somehow, through divine grace, I recalled him saying, what I'm pointing to is what is always here. And so I thought to myself, even in my anguish, well, it must be here now. And so I would make attempts to get back to some memory of that grace, and I would fail. And this was all just going on within one night. And then I stopped. I remembered he said, just stop everything. And at first, again, I felt this fear. If I stop, if I don't remember his teachings, if I don't try to practice his teachings, then I'll lose everything. And I also recalled him saying, that's good. In this moment, lose everything. So I had to lose my enlightenment. And in losing my enlightenment, unspeakably, this thunderclap of revelation where what really had been in the background was in the foreground, as if I had been walking around with my head in the sand, and then I was upright all of a sudden. I could see, and I could feel the residue of what the emotional anguish had done in my body, but I was free of the judgment of it. And so then I really came to, after many other experiences, that, as you just said, we are in these bodies, physically, emotionally, mentally, as well as the social body and the global body, cosmic body. And they all have their movement, like weather. Weather is the best example I know of. There's all kinds of weather. But if each time the sun was clouded and we ran out and cried and screamed, get the cloud away, it's just, there's this a direct knowledge that we know the sun is there. And if the sun isn't there, we know we perish. So I don't like to use the word evolution because I think it's really overused and misused, but this seems to be some kind of development, or at least there was for me, where I stopped reaching for a steady state of bliss or even stillness. And in that, I discovered, I guess, contentment and happiness. And there is room in that contentment, in that spaciousness, for all kinds of weather, physical, mental, emotional. Some weather is not pleasant, of course, and there's room for unpleasantness. It doesn't mean anything about what is always here. It's still here, and it can be checked. You can check and see. So I'm not in a state of, I'm in a corporal state, so I have the feelings of the corpus, and I have opinions and emotions, and I am still free in that.
So you referenced Ramana. For our audience who aren't familiar, Ramana Maharshi, the great sage of India, one of the most beloved and well-known sages of India, and also Nisargadatta, who was another teacher of direct awakening, and who some Westerners had the privilege of studying with. And so Ramana taught mostly through silence and also the practice of self-inquiry. And I wonder if you could talk about that practice a little bit, or that practice or that path of self-inquiry.
Well, I met Ramana through Papaji, so I really know him through Papaji, and the basic of what Papaji was saying when in order to find out what doesn't come and go, you have to still your mind. You have to be really alert and tell the truth. And so that was his rendition of inquiry. The most famous rendition of Ramana's inquiry is, who am I? Asking that question, who am I? And he was at his moment of awakening, so the story goes, he was distraught because his father had died, and so death was very much an issue for him as a 16-year-old. He lay on the floor of his house and he really asked, who dies? And he allowed his mind to be swallowed by his experience, which has been rendered in lots of different ways. But I actually use death and meeting death a lot in my conversations with people, because in general, that's what all of our suffering is, an avoidance of. So Papaji told a wonderful story about Ramana, though, that really humanized him for me. That Papaji was with him in the 40s, and he was with him when India was being partitioned, and it was a horrible time in the history of India, as India and Pakistan were made separate, as I'm sure you know. And Papaji was Hindu, but he lived in Lahore, which is in what is now Pakistan. So Ramana was reading a newspaper one day, and he said, aren't your people from Lahore? And Papaji said, yes, but you are my people. There's no one that exists except you. And he said, well, I was reading in the newspaper they're in big trouble. The Hindus have to get out fast. And Papaji said, well, it's all a dream. None of it exists for me. And Ramana said, well, since it's all a dream, what's the problem? Go to Lahore and get your family out. It was beautiful. And it really brought Papaji, in his telling, it really just grounded the realization in the relative reality as well as in the absolute reality. And that for me is the non-duality, that it's not absolute and it's not relative. It's they are in one self. So he did go to Lahore, and I think his people got out on one of the last trains, and it was a horrible time, lots of mayhem and horror. But he then lived in Lucknow for the rest of his life when he wasn't traveling. And That's where most of his meetings happen.
Mm-hmm. Well, tragic setting, but it's a wonderful story, and of course, a lot of our spiritual teachings from many traditions, this whole play of the relative and the absolute, and it often creates a lot of confusion. And I think it is very much so it's two sides of one coin, and neither side cancels out the other, right? But often people, they get into these arguments that are really a confusion between the two contexts of the relative and absolute, right? Or end up using absolute teachings in a way that it becomes transcendental or kind of bypassing in a certain way and not really dealing with the relative realities that we still live in as long as we have a body, right?
Yes, that's the way I see it.
Mm-hmm. You talk about in one of your books, our true radiance, connecting with our true radiance. This whole, that whole question of self, and who am I, right? And certain traditions, in Buddhism, we tend to not use the word self very much, or just talk about non-self. Sometimes in Zen, they use the self with a capital S, or your true nature. In Hinduism, often the Atman Brahman is called self with a capital S. Even in Buddhism, there were real arguments about whether you could say anything about our true nature. And if you said anything about it, gave it any kind of, you often got accused of being heretical, which is in Vajrayana Buddhism, even the term Vajra nature is, some Mahayanas said, not all Mahayanas, but some had trouble with that. And so, this whole thing of how do you talk about that, right? This idea of your true nature, your true radiance, who we are, that which doesn't change. I wonder if you could just talk about that a little bit, because I think it does get confusing for people, and it can really set up, like even, people often use in meditation, you develop that ability to step back from your experience a little bit and witness it or watch it or observe it. And some people talk about the watcher, which is actually a really profound development, to be able to witness our experience rather than being lost in it. But my teacher, Trungpa Rinpoche, really guarded against, he said, he didn't even want people to use the term watcher, because he didn't want us getting stuck there, reifying that. And, some people, I think, associate the witness at the most kind of impersonal level as maybe that's the self, the higher self, this kind of witness mind. And yet there are experiences where even that dissolves, certainly with psychedelic substances. And so anyway, I'm just laying out a little landscape here for you to explore, maybe in terms of your book and how people can experience this, and what do you mean by true radiance?
Yes, well, true radiance is, I would say finally, is what doesn't come and go. So it definitely, the experience of that can be cloaked with whatever you're feeling mentally or physically or emotionally or socially. But if you're willing to stop and be still, and that does rely on the willingness to still the mind, not as a witness watching the mind, but actually to stop the mind, to really allow whatever thought is arising, to allow that to fall back, to stop it in mid-thought, which some people assume means a suppression of thought, but it's possible to stop thought without suppressing it, to really simply be aware that in order to think, we actually have to engage in thinking. We have to follow thoughts and put thoughts together and make sense of thoughts, so that you can, in the simplest thought, I am thinking, you can rewind that, thinking am I. And you're at least for a moment without thought. And it's in that moment that you can have the question, which is in thought form, but it's asking, who am I? Or is this what doesn't come and go? And that question then becomes a living inquiry, so that the next time you're caught up in something, as we are bound to be, we're conditioned to be caught up in it for our survival. So I don't think that we have to be concerned with changing our conditioning, except, of course, if it's causing harm, but to recognize that the preconditioned self, or preconditioned intelligence, I should say, because self is a word that has really been used in too many different ways to have
it's confusing.
congruent meaning. It's like God or love or any number of things. But this intelligence, this awakeness, intelligence, doesn't have to think for its awakeness. And so for me, that was the biggest revelation of the early revelations. It was like, who am I if I am not thinking I am? Am I if I'm not thinking I am? And yes, in fact, I am. And in that, I am actually in direct experience of the radiance of being, just the being. I don't use Sanskrit much, but I love Satchitananda because I always have seen it as one word, one being, meaning, consciousness aware of itself as being, or being aware of itself as consciousness. And then the Ananda is the bliss of that, the point of that point that gets overlooked in our conditioning for survival. And not to make our conditioning wrong, because we want to survive. It's good to survive. But when it becomes only about survival, we overlook this deathless beingness, not this personal beingness, but including this personal beingness. I hope that didn't get too
No, that's beautiful. It's really beautiful. And points in the various paths of formless meditation, whether Shikantaza in Zen or Dzogchen or Mahamudra in the Tibetan tradition, one of the more liberating insights is that when one's mind is resting in that nature in that way, and that you have the clear insight that that any notion of there being somebody there that is witnessing that is simply a thought. It actually arises as a thought. You see it arise as a thought. And you have the concurrent realization that consciousness doesn't need you to be aware of it or to realize that it's aware of itself, that it's self-aware.
Yes. Oh, very well said. I'm glad to know how it fits in with the more elevated forms of the traditions. Yes.
Absolutely. So I'm curious. I've watched your dialogues, quite a few of them with students, and very often, you're in dialogue and someone will kind of have an insight or a moment of where the mind kind of stops, and maybe it's just the question who or something like that, or they get that a certain train of identification with suffering they're on is really based on a thought, and if you don't have that thought, if you question the source of that thought, the whole thing kind of crumbles away, and you have this moment of openness. So unless they're fortunate enough for that to be the kind of moment you had with your teacher, nonetheless, they're generally the suffering, the challenges we have comes back. So I'm wondering how what your experience is in working with students over the years of how they take these experiences, these gaps, if you will, and stabilize them in their lives or begin to live more from them. And I realize, and I like what you said about we don't necessarily have to solve all the conditioning. I have a friend that's often talked about the work that we do kind of on the conditioned mind. Is kind of like tinkering with the machine. There's a lot of good work you can do to have a better functioning this, right? A lot of types of therapy, all kinds of things. But at some point, there's a law of diminishing returns because you can tinker with it forever. And then you still, as long as you have a body, it's going to have certain movements, as you said. But then there's the other context of realizing that which is not defined by that, right? And so they're the two forms of work, and they're both important. But I think you're making clear that having the expectation that you're going to kind of get to where we all long to be by finally fixing the machine enough, or something. So you can realize what you're speaking to without having all of our conditioning healed and worked out and solved and all, but at the same time, that can really get in the way of resting in or having confidence in that realization. So I'm wondering what the path looks like for your students in your experience, how you work with people.
Well, I really, in my relationship with people, I give absolute permission to go directly home, however messed up you may be.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the Bay Area therapists really took issue with me saying that. And I felt like I gave rise to the term spiritual bypass. And so I owned it, I said, okay, spiritual bypass. We make a bypass to just get the fastest place we can get. If it's a highway bypass, that you bypass the village, you bypass all the happenings, and you just go home. If you choose to, get off the highway and go into the village, that's your choice. And maybe you're compelled to, maybe you have business there and psychological business in this context. But you always at least have permission. You are free. There's no toll. You are free to go directly home. And I have found that very few people actually accept that, because we are a psychologically determined subculture in general. And I respect therapy, psychological therapy, and the insights that have come from that, and the delights of deconstructing that. But there is a simplicity to being willing to just immediately be free or immediately stop. Mm-hmm. That you don't have to, there aren't prerequisites for that. That's what I saw that you've done prison work and have written a book about prison, and I would love to see that. But that's what I found in going into prisons, that because they were so ready for something, and many of them were psychologically astute, but many weren't. But they could hear, because they had failed in some ways, or society had failed, but they were up against failure. And so none of the tricks, those who were drawn to the meetings, let me clarify this, because only a small percentage of the prison population came to these meetings. But the percentage that did come were ready. And in that readiness, that is met with yes. And I've seen miraculous things be discovered by people who did not have psychologically together lives before that discovery. Perhaps part of the after is getting more psychologically healthy, but it wasn't a necessity. That's what I meant by the bypass. You're free to take the bypass. And then you see, most people won't, because I think we are, we like to stay together as a crowd, as human beings. And the big wave is psychotherapeutic. Maybe that's shifting a bit. It's certainly political psychotherapeutic. And so we generally, as part of that wave, believe that as actual propaganda. And that's what Papaji was so beautiful at revealing, because he had no interest in psychological insights, or as an Indian man, he just had never been interested in it. And he thought it was a silly kind of thing that we Westerners did. After a while, and through many meetings with different groups, he said, okay, it helps people. He could see it helps people, but he didn't see that it had anything to do with awakening.
It's really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was very interesting. And I think we're all products of this psychotherapeutic subculture. Certainly the insights of that from the 19th century on, anyway, have been profound and enriching. I'd say it's an enriching experience, mm-hmm. and useful if that's what you need. And who can even say you do need it? I don't know who determines that, but you feel you need it, or you're drawn to it, or it appears in your life. I have seen many people have a flash of profound insight, and the mind is not strong enough to surrender to that. Mm-hmm. It's so addicted to thinking, and so addicted to certain patterns of evaluation of life and activity, that it becomes just a cycle. And there's great suffering in that, because people know that they've lost something, that they touched something, right. and then they lost it, and how to get it back. But I say you can't get it back. It's gone. If it could be lost, it will be lost.
Mm-hmm.
So then the challenge is to lose whatever it is you are clinging to now, which often for those people is to get that back, to get that taste of enlightenment back.
Right. That can really get you caught in a loop.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, this is really interesting territory. And the whole interface between some of the Eastern yogic traditions, all the kind of spirituality that came from the East in all its many forms, and the modern therapeutic and psychology culture of the West. And of course, that's a broad spectrum. In the 60s, there was a lot of really insightful and kind of more challenging kind of waking up work done with Gestalt and things like that. And then there's the kind of psychotherapy that's much more constructive, really trying to help us patch up the wounds and so forth, which I think can be because some people's lives are incredibly debilitated by wounds. And so that can be very important. Although today we have, there is kind of a sense where in some ways, the overlap between the cultures of psychotherapy and certainly the cultures of Western Buddhism and mindfulness and so forth have overlapped to the extent that trying to create a kind of spiritual path that is so safe and safe for what? And in some sense, safe for the small mind that's woundable. And this isn't to make light of people's suffering at all. I think it's really wonderful that it's there, and I think it has helped many teachers become more emotionally intelligent and softer. And but nonetheless, it kind of can create a path that's nobody's going to wake up in, because there's really no challenge. And then it's also, there's some elements of it that almost encourage a kind of identifying with a kind of victim mindset in a sense, right?
That's a shame.
So there's, it's a broad landscape, and I don't mean to demonize all of it, because there's wonder and beauty in it. But around this issue of, there's two things I want to bring up. One, this idea of, giving people permission to just go home, right? And, so we know that until it's not, the possibilities of self-deception run pretty deep. And one can think one's home. And, and we've had quite a few teachers who thought they were home, proclaimed they were home, but manifested in the world. And maybe in some cases, just something we didn't understand, but other times pretty clearly, not so enlightened behavior. And so there can be a lot of self-deception around that sense of being home, especially if one hasn't done one work. Somehow that what's sometimes referenced as the shadow or our unfinished business rears its ugly head and undermines someone who clearly has probably had some kind of realization, right? But so there's that element of it. I wonder the question about self-deception, and maybe you could address these separately. But one of your books, I don't know if it's your latest books, Hidden Treasure, Uncovering the Truth of Your Life Story. So I'm wondering, the idea of personal narrative and story and the meaning that gives our lives versus these kinds of experiences that are really beyond narrative and beyond identification with anything, much less, a life narrative. So I guess it's a two-part question, but maybe self-deception, and then what is the value of narrative, and how do we work with our life story?
Well, I'd say primarily with narrative in terms of this teaching and in terms of awakening in general, just to realize you have a narrative is essential. And that's most people in the world, I would say, aren't even interested in their narrative. They have no idea that the thoughts that are cascading. So that's the first challenge, is this willingness to overhear yourself.
And see how that's driving how we're being in the world, that narrative. Yeah. Yes,
that's right. Well, even just to simplify, just to be willing to overhear yourself in a moment so that you can stop, so you can stop the narrative. It's like, what narrative? That's news to people. So that's the first thing, is the narrative is very valuable as a call. As a call home, even, because you get to see suffering is often simply generated by an old narrative. that you may not even be aware of you're saying. So even I think this is where it can dovetail with psychotherapy. In psychotherapy, you can learn to get very astute about what you're telling yourself, or at least psychotherapy that with a spiritual bent to it. So that's the self-deception. Well, that keeps us all humble, doesn't it? I mean, Papaji said, vigilance is key. You have to be vigilant. And I asked him, what do you mean vigilant? He said, you have to be aware of what your narrative is and your capacity to stop that. You have to be able to be still. You never outgrow that. And what I hear him saying when I look back on that is that our brains are constructed a certain way, and we're not going to transcend that. What we can do is see through that. And that requires vigilance, which is simply the way he was talking about it, and the way I share it with people, is the willingness to tell the truth. It's like one of these teachers that I don't know that you were referring to him necessarily, but somebody who had a great awakening and had a collection of students and then did some really horrible things and fell from grace and then got his whole thing, got how it happened, the inflation that happened that took the place of the deflation that he was so willing to surrender, and how then that just became this spin of egomania. So that's always possible with any of us, because that keeps us humble in the sense of, what are you aware of, and what are you narrating? And not as a what are you aware of and bad girl thinking that, but just the willingness. Well, I asked Papaji because I remember the Buddhist that I was around, it said 10 years after your awakening. It takes 10 years and before you know you're established. So I asked Papaji, and he said, it takes your whole life. He said, you have to be vigilant until your last breath. And it's a joy to be vigilant. It's a keeping vigil. It's not a punishment, which is the way I was holding it when I asked him that question. But it's really the joy of recognizing that you're not a superhuman because you have realized this. You're still human.
I love that. I've actually been teaching vigilance forever, and I don't often hear other people use that word. And it's not paranoia, and it's not punishing yourself. It's just realizing the situation we're in, about how the many layers of self-deception that are possible, and how as long as we have a body and a brain and all that's going on, that we need to be awake.
Yes,
we need,
that's
and
right.
that's what we're talking about, being awake. So being awake means you're really awake.
You're vigilant.
You have to be awake, so because you could notice that the subtlety of that shift into inflation can be so subtle. And then the world can really help you along with that. Especially if you're in the role of a teacher, they can just be, get more inflated because now you're fulfilling my projections, right? And
that's right. That's right. It's a slippery slope.
Very slippery slope, right? Yeah. So I love that. And also I'm going to get you. I hope I'm going to do my best here to get you out from under the cloud of spiritual bypassing any such accusations, because what you pointed to about the narrative and our suffering, this isn't what I'm hearing you saying, that anytime our suffering is arising, our human suffering, it's really a call. It's like we're being called to come home, right? And it's not like we're being dismissive of that or just, wishing it away. It's actually, it's something's arising in our life calling to us. And so many people have had awakenings after periods of tremendous suffering, or surrendering to some kind of deep abandonment or aloneness or pain of some kind, right? And so I don't hear you diminishing that very human experience at all. Actually,
I feel it's just exactly as you say. The nature of suffering, it's to get our attention, even at a superficial level, but at the deepest level. To suffer is to be willing to put your attention into that. And I would say, rather than the narrative of that, into the direct experience of that, because that suffering actually takes you home, really. And so the willingness to suffer and the willingness to be human are really finally the same thing.
Wow. Well, I think that's a wonderful place for us to bring our conversation to a close. Really, I've really enjoyed this. Thank you so much for everything you've offered, Gangaji, and everything you continue to offer the world. So people can find out about you on your website, which is, I had it here, just gangaji.com. Is that it?
Org.
Gangaji.org.
GANGAJI.org. Yeah.
Okay. And I know you make the teaching very available. People can watch past dialogues, but you offer weekly. You offer a lot. Probably like most people are offering a lot online now. And
yes.
And you're based in Oregon. Are you doing in-person stuff again?
I'm going to start in the spring having very small groups where we can socially distance enough, and we'll give it a try. Small group meetings, weekend retreats.
Wonderful. If anybody has the opportunity to do that, I really encourage it. But you're very available online, and so I encourage people to check out Gangaji's teaching and your incredible generosity of continuing to bring this to the world. So thank you so much.
I'm so happy to have met you and meet you.
Me too. My pleasure. Really a joy. So be well.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you.